London, late 12th century. England was still a faint smudge on the map of the world, but within its grey stone city walls something far more disturbing than military secrets was being sealed, the filthiest truths of an emerging justice system. In 1188, during the reign of King Henry II, as whispers of legal reform spread across Europe, the king decided it was time to modernise England's judicial process. No more trials by river or fire, no more waiting for divine judgment on blistered feet. Now there would be investigations, there would be verdicts, there would be prisons. That's when Newgate was born, not as a symbol of justice, but as a festering wound beneath the skin of the city. Built directly atop the western gate of London, Newgate repurposed the remnants of old Roman watchtowers and stone walls. But what rose there was no longer meant to guard against invaders. It was built to hold thieves, prostitutes, debtors, murderers, and those innocent souls who happened to be crushed by the grinding teeth of a flawed system. There were no divisions. Men and women slept shoulder to shoulder on wet stone floors under rotting wooden beams where bedbugs rained down from cracks in the ceiling. There were no distinctions of crime. A boy who stole a loaf of bread could be locked beside a killer awaiting trial for weeks, months, sometimes years until death came first, whether by starvation, disease, or a fist from the bunkmate above. But the worst thing wasn't what people saw. It was what they smelled. The stench of human waste and rotting rats. The metallic tang of dried blood on stone. The sickly sweet reek of infected flesh. No medicine, no treatment, no hope. The odour of silent despair soaked deep into the walls, the bars, and every panicked breath under the dim flicker of a dying torch. The prison guards, known as keepers, didn't receive a fixed salary. Instead, they made their living by squeezing it from the inmates. Want a crust of bread? Pay up. Want a ragged blanket that cost extra? Want to loosen your shackles for an hour? That'll be even more. Have nothing, then eat filth to stay alive. A 13th century account once noted, "This prison does not hold men. It grinds their souls to dust, then leaves the hollow body to starve in the dark." From its inception, Newgate wasn't merely a prison. It was a machine of punishment, finely tuned, fully legal, and entirely intentional. Trials at the time resembled gambling more than justice. There were no lawyers, no formal defence, no organised argument. People were locked inside merely because someone accused them. No conviction, no sentence. Yet they were still beaten, starved, coerced, violated, and killed without explanation. There were no reliable records, no names to remember. Many vanished inside Newgate as though they had never existed at all. And worse still, the outside world knew. Londoners called it hell on earth, not as a metaphor, but as an accurate geographic description. They could smell the place from hundreds of feet away, hear the screams slice through stone during midnight beatings, and witness bodies being dragged out each morning wrapped in burlap dumped like garbage. From the very foundations of that place, corruption began seeping into the bloodstream of English justice. Newgate wasn't just a building. It became the first true symbol of a legal death sanctioned by indifference, financed by poverty, and forced through unchecked power. By the 13th century, England had entered a sweeping wave of legal reform. Local trials were replacing blood-soaked rituals, and people believed this would usher in fairness. But fairness demands more than procedures, it demands humanity. And within the walls of Newgate there was no room left for compassion. In 1236, Newgate was expanded with public funding. New towers were built, dungeons dug deeper, more cells added. The walls grew thicker not to resist uprisings, but to muffle the sound of screaming. For every new law etched on paper, a new pit was carved into the ground. For every reform proclaimed in Parliament, a new cell opened its mouth for another forgotten body. When King Henry III ordered the expansion of other gatehouse prisons, Newgate remained the first name uttered whenever sanctioned torture was needed. Class divisions became more visible than ever. To the left, nobles and those who could pay for silence. To the right, the human cages where the poorest rotted in heaps. Money could buy anything: blankets, firewood, real food, and sometimes erasure from the official ledger. Those with nothing were tossed into the lowest chambers where the sewage flowed year-round, and the only light came from torches fed with rendered fat. A report from 1281 recorded a staggering $66 spent solely on cleaning the latrines used by wealthy prisoners, an unimaginable amount at the time, enough to feed an entire farming village for months. Meanwhile, in the lower levels of the prison, where the poor were packed in like vermin, there were no proper toilets at all. People defecated where they slept beside their wounds next to slowly decomposing corpses. The plagues came in waves. Lice, fleas, ticks and bedbugs so numerous they crunched underfoot as the keepers walked through mouldy corridors. Jail fever, what modern historians now believe was typhus, began to spread. People died in clusters, died without warning, died without burial. And then came 1315. In just 1 year, 62 deaths were officially recorded in the city's coroner's book. The real number may have been twice that. On certain nights, guards refused to go below, not for fear of riots, but because some prisoners had gone mad, clawing their fingernails against the stone walls until they bled, then smearing their own names across the rock in crimson as if to declare I was here. I existed. The legal system kept reforming. But corruption evolved right alongside it. The keeper system had rotted from within. When the law required prison keepers to fund operations out of their own pockets, bribery wasn't just common, it was survival. The warden sold everything from stale bread to single gulps of water. For 3 shillings a week you got a bed and a blanket. If you had nothing, you slept next to the dead. The sin no longer lay in the crimes of the inmates. It was in the system itself, in the silence of a government that allowed human dignity to decay, and in every stone added to the prison without a single word of remorse. By the mid-14th century, people avoided even walking past Newgate's gates, not out of fear of guards, but because of the smell, because of the wide dead eyes watching through the cracks. Because the name Newgate was no longer just a location, it had become a whispered curse in the heart of London. A place created to uphold justice had become the clearest proof that justice could be buried beneath garbage, beneath blood, beneath history's chilling silence. When a prisoner died at Newgate, there were no bells tolled, no prayers said, no candles lit. They were dragged away wrapped in whatever sack could be found, leaving behind a damp, foul-smelling hollow in the stone where the next inmate would lie. But when death became routine, predictable people were finally forced to look. Not out of compassion, but because the disease was spreading outward into the city. In 1419, after a series of deadly outbreaks, authorities had no choice but to temporarily shut Newgate down. At least 22 people died that year, officially, mostly from jail fever, which spread through lice, mites and fleas in filthy airless conditions. There was no sunlight, no ventilation-contaminated drinking water, and floors slick with liquids no one dared name. Those who didn't die of illness lived in a state of skeletal delirium, hallucinating and mentally unravelling as though the prison itself was slowly devouring them piece by piece. Meanwhile, outside the law was still undergoing what scholars called reform. Statutes were passed, regulations proclaimed. But inside Newgate nothing changed. Power still lay in the hands of brutal keepers with no salary and no shame. They lived off the prisoners. If you had money, you could buy warm meals, dry blankets, even protection from beatings. If all you had was your body, then your body was what you paid with forced labour servitude or worse. Take the case of the jailer John Shep. He was accused of snapping a prisoner's neck because the man couldn't pay his fee. Another report revealed 2 keepers, Lorimer and Croydon, who routinely tortured inmates with methods that would make even battlefield interrogators recoil, pouring boiling water into prisoners' boots, peeling skin from fingers suspending men by their ankles for hours in the dead of night. These weren't classified as torture. The official books recorded them as reasonable coercion. Even pregnant women were not spared. Some deliberately conceived to delay a hanging, but when labour came they gave birth right there on the cell floor. No midwife, no medicine, no clean water. Most infants died within days, either from infection or the cold. Then came the year 1449. An incident occurred so horrifying that even the most jaded city scribes recorded it in disbelief. A young female prisoner burning with fever and too weak to move was reportedly raped by her own keeper, while delirious. There were witnesses. One surviving letter from a city physician to his wife refers to an intolerable act that has been completely silenced. The girl's name never appeared in court documents again. Her file vanished. The keeper's name disappeared from records, but he was never tried nor dismissed. Newgate remained silent, as if it had swallowed the truth whole. As for the girl, she may have died. She may have been released. Or perhaps she still lived somewhere deep inside the walls, no longer human. Because in Newgate, the most terrifying thing wasn't the crime. It was the crime that disappeared, and the fact that no one was ever held accountable. To be fair, the government did attempt some control. In 1346, after a flood of complaints and petitions from prisoners' families, the Royal Council issued a ban keepers were forbidden to accept bribes, for better treatment, for food, for faster trials. But like every law written for a lawless place, the ban meant nothing. It was like tossing a coin into a bottomless pit. The keepers kept their black market alive. If anything, the ban only raised prices. But even hell needs a renovation now and then. By 1423, Newgate had decayed so badly it was on the verge of collapse. That year, the wealthy and widely admired Mayor of London, Dick Whittington, left a large sum in his will to rebuild the prison's entire infrastructure. Some said he did it out of compassion. Others said it was simply to save face for the city because the stench from Newgate had started reaching all the way to the church steps. Whatever the reason, the sum was enough to rebuild the entire gatehouse, expand the prison walls, add new chambers, and reinforce the crumbling arches. The construction dragged on for 8 years, and cost hundreds of pounds, enough to raise and feed a small army. When finished, the new Newgate could hold around 150 inmates divided into supposedly clear categories, at least on paper. There was a chapel where prayers hung heavy in helpless silence. There was even a fountain in the prison yard meant to symbolise reform, but the water remained filthy, murky brown and reeking like every other corner of that building. Real change didn't come in the form of mortar and stone. It came in how openly money began to dictate a person's fate, no longer hidden, no longer ashamed. Wealthy prisoners failed, merchants, disgraced landowners fallen. Nobles could purchase peace. They lived on the upper levels where light filtered through windows and warmth radiated from fireplaces. They paid for private bedding, for food delivered from outside, for the privilege of sleeping unchained. Some even hired servants to bring their meals as if stuck in a slightly less pleasant hotel. Meanwhile, the poor were shackled in the stone pits below. No bed, just damp flagstone. No blanket, just garbage and lice. To loosen their chains and avoid numb, withered limbs, they had to pay. If they had nothing, they bartered with forced labour with their bodies or with complete submission. Firewood was sold at 3 times the street price a penny bought only a fistful of dead ash. A single onion, a scrap of bread, or a spoonful of gruel might buy them one day without a beating. Justice here didn't live in law. It lived in pockets. And the new prison, with its fresh plaster-painted walls and decorative fountain, was simply a more polished version of the old hell, its very foundation soaked with the stench of inequality, cruelty and truth bought and sold. Not every soul locked inside Newgate was a villain. In fact, most weren't. They were the starving who stole bread, the mother who lifted a scrap of cloth to swaddle her child, the peasant caught carrying a knife for protection in the market. In a city where law flexed to the weight of one's coin purse, and the whim of a judge's mood ending up in jail didn't require savagery, only poverty or misfortune. A single flare of temper, a drawn blade, 15 days. A shallow cut during an argument, 40 days. That was the surface, the justified side. Beneath it, Newgate's mould-stained gates stood ready to swallow anyone guilty or innocent. Poor or once noble, whether they'd survive or not didn't matter. People still remember the case of William at Seal, a baker who made a living in the southern market of London. William didn't kill anyone. All he did was use a curved board to make his loaves a few grams lighter, sold at the usual price but earning a few extra pence. It was a survival trick, one that many poor folks relied on during a time when grain prices were soaring. But once discovered, he was swiftly charged with serious fraud and thrown into Newgate, along with 11 others, including 2 female street vendors who had bought flour from him. Everyone in the group was imprisoned, but William was singled out for public humiliation. He was bound to a stake in the city square where citizens were encouraged to hurl rotten vegetables, spoiled eggs and curses at his face. A poor man shamed not for killing but for daring to bend the rules, in a system built so that only the wealthy were allowed to. The contrast couldn't be starker with Sir Thomas Malory Knight, nobleman, former sheriff and judge, who landed in Newgate in 1451 with much heavier charges, rape, extortion, and attempted murder of the Duke of Buckingham. But prison wasn't the same for everyone. Malory never touched a dungeon wall, never wore chains. He had a private room, clothes sent from home, access to paper, ink and time. Within the same stone blocks where others screamed themselves to death, he calmly wrote the first draft of Le Morte d'Arthur, a grand tale of ideal knights' morality and justice. They say that whenever he paused in his writing, the wailing from the lower floors still echoed through the door. But Malory never wrote about them. He was released in 1461 not because he was proven innocent, but because the government changed hands. His crimes were swept away by political winds as if they never existed. Then there was John de Munden, a name nearly buried in prison logs. No one really remembers what he did. What's known is that in 1352 he wrote a desperate plea to the sheriff, claiming he had been wrongly imprisoned for 5 years, all because of a clerical error on his legal form. One wrong box, one wrong word, and the machine swallowed him whole. His petition was rejected for lack of sufficient grounds. His file grew thicker each year, not from new crimes, but from the passage of time as he was forgotten. And then there was Thomas Usk, a writer, a former secretary, a man who once testified against powerful figures. But times changed. What he once revealed turned into a curse against himself. He was accused of treason, one of the few crimes that required no real proof, only a strong enough accuser. Usk was sentenced to be dragged, hanged, and beheaded. His head was ordered to be mounted on Newgate's gate as a warning. They say it took 30 axe strikes to sever his head. Not because the blade was dull, but because the executioner had orders to go slow to stretch the agony like a theatre of blood until the audience felt justice. The crowd gathered under the stone gate that day said nothing, but many recalled how that night the city fell unusually silent, as if something deeper than a man had been killed. The building finally collapsed in 1777. After nearly 6 centuries as an open wound on the body of London Newgate, was dismantled stone by stone, beam by beam, corridor by corridor, still reeking with the scent of rotting skin. There was no funeral, no hymns, no one wept in the dark. It was torn down like any decayed structure meant to make way for modern law. But what had happened inside wasn't part of the blueprints, and it didn't vanish with the rubble. Today, the Central Criminal Court Old Bailey stands on that very ground. A clean structure, neatly designed pale stone walls and a stately dome. Here the crimes of the 21st century are judged murder, terrorism, fraud. Judges in black robes speak in polished British accents. No one mentions the screams that once echoed through these very walls. No one speaks of the lightless cells buried beneath their feet, where people were held until they no longer recognised their own voice. All that remains is a small blue plaque mounted on the side of the courthouse site of Newgate Prison. Demolished 1777. No further words, no names of the prisoners, no remembrance of the victims, no apology for nearly 6 centuries of torment carried out in the name of justice. Just a marker to fulfil historical obligation barely glanced at by passers-by. People walk past as if it's a date on a calendar, not the entrance to a hell that once stood wide open. But Newgate isn't entirely dead. Some of it, the old dungeon segments, a few crumbling stone cells, is believed to still exist beneath the Viaduct Tavern less than 100 steps away. A Victorian-style pub, well-lit, cosy, crowded with after-work drinkers. People laugh there, clink glasses, share stories under warm yellow lights. They have no idea that just beneath the wooden floorboards lies a staircase leading to an entirely different world. A place with no music, no beer, and no forgetting. Those who've gone down there, the old owners, storage workers, a handful of reckless historians tell stories nobody wants to believe. Some say the lights died the moment they stepped inside, untouched switches refusing to respond. Some say they heard faint moans seeping through the stone walls long since sealed off. But the most terrifying tale involves a former landlord years ago. He went down to check the water pump flashlight and keys in hand. The door closed behind him. The light blinked out, and then total blackness. No sound. No idea how long he stood there. Until a voice whispered in his ear, slow and cold and terrifyingly close, "It's just you and me down here now." They found him an hour later sitting against the wall, hands shaking. He didn't speak for 3 days. He quit. Moved away from the city. Never came back. The story spread, then was laughed off like a pub legend. But no one ever went into the cellar alone again. They say every time an innocent soul dies in Old Bailey, a shadow appears at the pub's doorstep. A gaunt black dog no one dares to touch, pacing slowly near the fence, as if searching for something long buried. It doesn't bark, it doesn't scratch, it just stares, and disappears before dawn. Newgate is now just an old name buried beneath stone, and replaced by clean plaster, bright lights, polished courtrooms and lawyers in tidy suits. But in the heart of the city, and in the conscience of British history, it remains like a scar no rebuilding can erase. This wasn't just a prison. It was where the entire medieval power structure revealed its naked truth, where justice was sold, where the innocent languished longer than the wealthy guilty, where religion saved no one, and reform merely polished the face of cruelty. This was a place where society didn't need machines to torture people. It used silence, it used time, it used forgetting. Newgate witnessed tens of thousands of lives pushed to the brink, crushed, erased without record. Its walls once shook from smothered screams. Its doors once looked out on a world no prisoner belonged to anymore. It was the grandest symbol of a broken justice, one that didn't protect, only punished. Didn't reveal, only judged in the dark. Today, all that's left is a small blue plaque nailed to a stone wall, offering no explanation for 600 years of state-sanctioned suffering. But anyone who walks close enough can still feel it. This place once had a door that opened not just into the earth, but into the human mind, where darkness was once made law. Newgate lives on in memory as a lesson history should never unlearn. A warning carved from bone, breathed out in the final gasps of those whose names were never carved in stone. And in every verdict, every court ruling, every seal of justice pressed today, one question still hangs in the air, quiet but heavy. Did we ever truly leave that place?